This time, FA Cup pioneers, when public schools in the home counties ruled football. Hello and welcome to By Far the Greatest Team, a podcast in which football fans attempt the impossible to rank once and for all who is the greatest team of all time. My name is Graham Dunn, making the case as ever for Oxford United, and joining me, King of the Data, Jamie Rooney.
Yeah, we really are trying the impossible tonight, Graham. Oxford United didn't exist. Manchester United didn't exist. Going back to where we're going to start with this one, I just hope by the time we get to the end of this, we've still got the same people that started listening to how we rank and who we rank and how we wrap this episode up. But it is an important competition, the FA Cup. It's a very important. It's kind of been downplayed wrongly in the last few decades, but it's such an important competition in the history of football. It deserves its place, and here we are reading off Wikipedia pages tonight just to make sense of it.
Yeah, and there's an argument that Oxford Uni is about as close as Oxford United will have or ever come to winning the FA Cup, it has to be said. As you like to do when we drift into the historical world, we're joined this week by Phil Craig. Hi, Phil.
Hi there. Hi, good to see you both. It's worth mentioning, isn't it, just to get in early, that this is the anniversary of possibly the greatest FA Cup final in 1973. This is the day it actually kind of happened in 1973. But just like you, Jamie, in the research that I've done, I didn't fully appreciate how important the FA Cup was for the development of the game. So I'm sure we'll touch on that as we go through the years.
There appears to be seldom a day where it's not a Sunderland anniversary of some sort, Phil.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, I got in early this time, didn't I?
Yes, it's been an interesting one. As you say, we're looking at the early period of the FA Cup, and we thought it was an interesting chance to look at how the tournament evolved. And there are some absolutely crazy stories around this time, which I absolutely love. And whilst I appreciate there was some normality with why things happened the way they happened, because, they were still defining the rules, some of the oddities of it are brilliant. And then there's, in amongst that period, it's extraordinary how teams near where we are, who have absolutely no footballing pedigree at all in the modern game, the Marlows, Maidenhead, the Wickhams of this world. You didn't even question the Wickhams. I like that. The ideas of games that would be in the Bucks and Berkshire or Oxfordshire Senior Cup are in the FA Cup quarterfinals. It's really, really odd in that respect. And then it's interesting to see how that ends.
Yeah, I think there's a very clear explanation for it as well. Football, back in the 1850s and 1860s, when it was trying to formalize itself with various different rules up and down the country, was primarily in the South, put together by a bunch of public schools. It was for the elites. It was for the upper classes in terms of who played football. And I think when the students that had moved on from your public schools and went into work in the home counties, they clearly took the recreation game with them and set up clubs so they could continue playing this sport they played at public schools. It's no coincidence that teams like Marlow, you mentioned, were founded in 1870, which is just 7 years after the Football Association has set up the rules, and probably a time where a couple of boys that have been to Harrow have moved into the home counties, set up base by the River Thames at the Complete Angler, and decided to form a football team.
So, the FA Cup, how much is this kind of the first tournament, and how does it even happen?
We can probably trace it back to even the 1860s. So we'll mention them a few times, but the Football Association, the FA, the first meeting took place on the 26th of October, 1863, for, quote, the purpose of promoting the adoption of a general code of rules for football. And this was all part of the attempt to kind of formalise the rules. So you had different sets of rules in different sets of the country. So probably more in the south, you had the Cambridge rules from the 1840s. And then you had the Sheffield rules in the 1850s, which dominated in the north. And there was this kind of constant battle in the early stages of the game, which was probably a barrier to the development of the game because nobody could actually agree what football really was. And there were probably two kind of competing theories of the game as well between dribblers and handlers, probably reflecting a lot of what people thought in terms of football and rugby. And it was with the formation of the Football Association that we probably kind of started to see the development, or at least some of the early development of the game and some of the kind of solving of the quandary of what football would actually look like. So I think it took around 5 further meetings of the Football Association before Association Football published its first set of rules in 1863. And you kind of see some similarities with what we kind of reflect on today. And we see, at least sometimes when you watch our team, so 11-a-side, non-handling game, but with certain aspects of rugby as well. So there was a rugby-style offside law that required all of a team's players to be behind the ball when the ball was kind of kicked forward before it was changed later in 1866, when 3 players were required to be between the attacker and the goal.
I mean, this is the birth of tactics as well, football tactics. And that rugby law that was in football in the 1860s, where you basically, you couldn't be above the ball, ahead the ball, otherwise you'd be offside. It's the reason why teams were set up, and you look at the formations in like a 1-2-7 or a 2-2-6, or in some extreme cases, a 1-1-8 formation. You would stack it with your forwards across the whole length of the pitch in a very similar style that we see rugby play today, where you've got forwards that are kind of lined up, ready to receive the ball backwards so they can go forwards, which has always been a bit of a mind F for me.
And we'll probably touch on this later on as well, but in the English game, the TV kind of series, one of the first shots you see is the 2 teams coming onto the pitch. And there's the old Etonians and Darwin in this case. And they do come on in what I would kind of recognise as a pyramid formation. They kind of trotted on, probably something similar to what I would see with some kind of pack or something from rugby.
So it is worth saying our key points of reference here are Wikipedia and Julian Fellowes' adaptation or it's not an adaptation, Julian Fellowes' Netflix drama, The English Game. One or other may be more or less reliable than the other as a source material.
That's right, yeah. And we're all big fans of Downton Abbey and Upstairs, Downstairs, aren't we? So, it was natural.
And he feels absolutely right. There were so many different rules across the whole of the country at the time. And then in Scotland, you've got the Scots developing what they call the passing game, which is a completely different version of football that's being played in England. And you've got the Sheffield rules, the Cambridge rules, the Nottingham rules. But even in the South, in the public schools, Eton, Harrow, Rugby, Westminster, Charterhouse, they were all playing different versions. Some would allow more handling. Some would allow more physical contact. They would then spend their times in the bars arguing about, what is hacking, what is tripping, what is carrying the ball, catching the ball. So they're shaping this game as they go along because it's very new and they try to codify it. And the FA has given them a structure, but even when that structure is in place, they're still trying to find ways to change the laws of football. There were no markings as well, Graham. I don't know if you know that. There were no pitch markings at all when football started in the 1860s, up until the first few FA Cups as well, with no pitch markings. So you don't have your goal pit areas. You don't have the center circle to mark how far you need to stand away from the ball, and no crossbars, just a bit of tape between the 2 posts.
I'm impressed with the tape, actually. I did like to think it was kind of old school football at break time kind of rules. No, that went over.
Yeah. Jumpers as goalposts as well. At least you have goalposts, if not a bar.
But can you imagine the business opportunities back then? Football's this brand new game. It's up and down the country. You've got the 2 posts at either end, and they're putting some tape. And obviously that tape needs to be strong, so you don't get the dispute. Was it above or below the tape line? I can only imagine that, this is Victorian Britain. We're right in the heart of industry. There must have been organisations out there thinking, we're going to create tape for football pitches, only to, 7-8 years later, be lamenting the idea, they've only gone and put a bloody bar between the 2 posts. Go out of business, boys.
It seems quite strange in that why couldn't you have a crossbar in football when you've got rugby posts that at least have that and a little bit extra on the sides? Why couldn't you have a bar? Anyway.
But that is quite strange, considering that rugby and football come from the same place. The fact that they seem to have mismanaged what is quite an important part of the game, the goal.
Oh, so we're in that adaptation stage. How did they get to the idea of having an FA Cup?
The first official set of Football Association laws had been published in 1863, but not kind of uniformly adopted across the country. And you'd had the first matches under the new FA rules, which had taken place in the early 1860s. I think it was a game between Barnes and Richmond in 1863. But despite all of that, the teams were still playing this kind of a patchwork of local friendlies for the most part, not really venturing beyond local boundaries to play their games. The game really was in its infancy, very much so. So it needed something of a stimulus. And as the National Association, it was incumbent, I think, upon the FA to draw the clubs together into a more kind of cohesive whole and to introduce a countrywide competition that it seemed to be the best kind of method of doing so, which is where one of the big characters of the early game starts to kind of enter the discussions. That was Charles W. Alcock. He was secretary of the FA. And he was already a prime mover in the game even before the FA Cup. So he was trying to get international football off the ground already by arranging a game between England and Scotland in 1870. Alcock was quite an interesting chap. He got into football from his school days and the inter-house matches that had taken place in Harrow, as well as his love and interest in the game. He played for Cock House, and I don't know if that is relevant or not, but that was his house at Harrow, Cock House. I don't know if it still exists to this day. And I think he was also thinking, and this will become important later on, that the opportunity to have games that went beyond local boundaries, which was much more possible because you're getting growth of the railways, which made, at least in theory, if not in practice, national travel more popular. There was less of an impediment for teams to kind of stay local, and instead you could have games all over England taking place. So you kind of whiz forward to 1871 and the meeting of the FA committee on the 20th of July, where Alcock proposed that it is desirable that a Challenge Cup, and I never understood why it was called the FA Challenge Cup, but anyway, so it's desirable that a Challenge Cup should be established in connection with the association, for which all clubs belonging to the association should be invited to compete. And I think probably partly because most of the people and the 11 representatives around the table probably all went to, if not the same, then similar public schools. The motion was carried unanimously. And a few rules followed on as well. So the rules of the knockout competition were agreed later on in 1871. And actually, a lot of the rules used and established back in the 1870s persist to this day as well, including, I think, if this is true, the idea of a player being cup-tied and the notion of tied games resulting in a replay being introduced through those first rules that were established. Also, interestingly, one last point, it was also at this point that the first trophy was commissioned and made. Even at the time, £20 was a relatively modest amount of money to pay for a trophy. And it was just 46 centimetres high as well. But, you know, you got the rules, you got the backing of the FA, and you've got a trophy. And it was at that point that the FA made invitations to the FA's 50-member clubs, asking for interest in joining the first FA Cup.
You know, the railway network, Bill, you mentioned is crucial because the rules give the FA Cup, even football, a reason to exist, because there is now something that kind of brings all of the teams affiliated to the Football Association, the 50 teams as it was back in 1871, a reason to compete. But the railways is what allows it to grow. Queen's Park from Scotland take part in 5 or 6, I think even more than that, Graham, FA Cups, reaching 2 finals as well. And they're allowed to do that because they can travel from Scotland. They didn't always travel from Scotland. They did actually fail to fulfill a few fixtures occasionally.
Yeah. Despite that, and it's true, and we'll probably chart the development of clubs from outside of the home counties in particular, but I think in the first FA Cup, there were only 2 teams from outside of what we'd call kind of London and the home counties. Queen's Park being one of them, and Donington Grammar School from Lincolnshire being the other. So it was very much a London home counties game at this point.
And what I like most about Donington and Queen's Park, 2 teams who are outside of the London and home counties area. And it's pretty clear that whatever method they attempt, that they are going to be drawn against each other from Graham Kelly's velvet bag or the equivalent at the time, because try as they do, they keep having to play each other.
Well, they're drawn against each other in the first edition, 71, 72. They actually don't fulfill the fixture because they couldn't agree a venue.
If at times this is a competition which seems like it's making the rules up as they go along, I mean, that is what's happening. And,
really is.
And one of the rules, as you pointed out, the notion of a replay to decide a game exists, but it doesn't default to a replay. From what I could gather, if there's a draw, or if in this occasion the good people of Donington and Queen's Park decide, do you know what? Should we play in Scotland or shall we play it in Lincoln? We can't agree on a venue. The answer is that we'll both go through, go into the next round, and hope to draw someone else. But, I wasn't there for the draw. But it does feel to me a little suspicious that the two teams outside of London and the home counties keep drawing each other.
Yeah, it's a gentlemanly way of doing it, really, isn't it?
So yes, Donington draw Queen's Park in the next round, and Donington, who I think decided it would just be quite a bit of a wheeze to enter the FA Cup as a bit of general fitness, decided that this was getting a bit out of hand, and so they withdraw. And they're not the only team that withdraws out of the first 15 that accept the invitation. At least two others drop out before the game, including, quite notably, Harrow Checkers, who drop out fulfilling their fixture against the Wanderers. Now, that obviously is going to become quite important because one of their star players, Morton Betts, goes on to score the winning goal for the Wanderers. But anyway, in the cup final. So there's a nice little twist to it.
Yeah, it's worth noting as well. I think he deserves his place in history. Jarvis Kendrick, playing for Clapton Rovers. He is officially the very first goal scorer in FA Cup history. I think he bags one of two in a game against Upton Park, who play at West Ham. That's not going to happen again. So Clapham Rovers beat Upton Park 3-0. Jarvis Kendrick, again, from public schools. I think he's a cricketer, a rugby player. All these guys in the early days, they all play multiple sports. And some of them even play, I can't remember who it was. I have to come back to it, though. There's a player who plays international football and rugby for Scotland. I can't remember who.
I want to say it's Archie Ryan Tutt, but it's Rynan something, isn't it? I'll remember.
Yes, it is. We'd have to come back to that and edit it in, I guess. But I think Jarvis Kendrick should really be given his place in history as the very first goal scorer in the FA Cup.
So they've started with 15 teams. Now, I love, as we followed from FIFA and their various World Cups, I love the different difficulties of how you go from, because obviously when there are 8 teams or 16 teams, it's really simple. Now 15 teams is quite manageable because you have 7 ties and you give one team, the fantastically named Hampstead Heathens, get a bye. And so there you go. You're going to have 8 teams in the quarterfinal stage. But that, of course, is until Donington and Queen's Park decide they can't fulfil the fixture. And then there's another game between Crystal Palace and Hitchin, which finishes 0-0. And again, should we have a replay or extra time? No, why don't we both go through? We'll just both go through.
And it was agreed on the day between the teams because there was no referee back in 1871. Each team would designate an umpire, somebody who would help adjudicate. The players would generally ref it themselves, and these 2 adjudicators would get involved if they needed to. Now, referees were introduced in the later rounds, so they did have independent referees. I say independent. I mean, it's such a closed group. Everyone knows everyone. So, they could agree to play extra time, or they could agree to say, we'll both go through to the next round. And that's exactly what Hitchin and Crystal Palace decided to do. And we should point out, Crystal Palace, this is not the Crystal Palace that are the current FA Cup holders, which will change probably by the time this goes out. So that's the Crystal Palace who are the former current holders of the FA Cup. Yeah, this is a completely different Crystal Palace. This Crystal Palace doesn't even exist these days.
I've just kind of mentioned that Higgledy-Piggledy. We should probably flag the teams that did enter this FA Cup. So Barnes, which is civil service, or come on the blobs, as Liz Truss would
Deep State.
Hitchin, Crystal Palace, not that Crystal Palace. Home counties, very local derby for us, Maidenhead and Marlow.
Who both still exist today.
Both still exist today. We will come on to Marlow at some point. Upton Park, Clapham Rovers, which Jarvis Kenrick gets the first goal. Queen's Park, Donington School. Royal Engineers, who've become quite a big team over this period. And the Wanderers. Now, there are two other sides, Reigate Priory and Harrow Checkers, who entered but didn't actually enter come the game.
The structure's crazy, though. I mean, I know we've got probably 12 or 13 FA Cup runs to talk through, but we have to talk about the first one and the craziness of the structure.
Well, yeah, because you've now managed to go from 15 teams, even though only 12 entered, but they've then ended up with 10.
Yeah.
Oh, no, 13 have entered at this stage still, but they've got 10 in the next round. Donington go out without kicking a ball, without entering. Now, actually, this round is relatively normal on the one hand. My favourite game is Barnes v Hampstead Heathens. Now, we've talked about there's a crossover with cricket at this time. There's a lot of cricketers playing football. And I think they maybe take it too literally because the game finishes 1-1 after 68 minutes, abandoned, bad light, stop play. Now, that's proper cricket, isn't it?
You'd have thought they would have continued on and played really anyway, but who knows what the weather conditions were like at the time.
Just pointing out, the game is taking place on the 23rd of December. Yeah. So I have no idea what time they're kicking off, but if they decided that we'll kick off at 3 and we'll get it in, they really didn't understand the shortest day as well as we understand it nowadays.
These sides do create a bit of FA Cup history because they do decide that they're going to play a replay.
The first replay in FA Cup history as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yeah. So we then get to the semi-final stage or the quarter-final stage, depending what but we've now got 5 teams. We've got to give one team a bye. Well, why don't we decide that the team from Scotland can have the bye? I can't believe that's accidental.
So they've got to the semi-final, haven't they? Queen's Park effectively, with that bye, get to the semi-finals without kicking a ball.
Yeah. Queen's Park's route to the semi-finals is brilliant. In the first round, they draw Donington School, and there's no game played because they can't agree where to play. In the second round, they play Donington School as both teams to advance to the next round, whereby Queen's Park get the walkover, as you say, Phil. And then, Graham, you're absolutely right. In the third round, where there's 5 teams, 4 of them are based in and around London, if not all of them are in London. So Queen's Park get the bye, and I think that's probably down to transport. But yeah, so Phil, they get to the semi-finals of the first FA Cup without playing a single football match.
In the third round, Royal Engineers put out the mighty Hampstead Heathens, and Wanderers draw with Crystal Palace 0-0. There are quite a few 0-0s around here. And I guess rather than decide whether to have a replay or not, they decided it probably made sense if they both went through so that they could have some proper semi-finals, which they do. So we do finally have a more normal format with 4 teams to going through to the final. It's weird, actually. This first tournament is probably the closest to what we have now, where we have the semi-finals and finals played at the Showpiece Ground, isn't it? All those games are played at Kennington Oval.
It could be a complete coincidence, but the fact that the semi-finals, and I think the finals took place at the Kennington Oval, might have said something about the sway that Charles Alcock has, because as well as being secretary of the FA, he's also the secretary of Surrey County Cricket Club as well.
And he's also captain of the Wanderers. We should probably point that out as well, if we haven't made that clear yet.
Yeah. And the Wanderers have had a pretty nice route to the final as well. When you pick apart, I mean, they've won a few games. They get a bye, as you mentioned, against the Harrow Checkers in the first round. They do win their second game against Clapham Rovers. And then in the third round, where we've got these 5 teams, they draw 0-0 with Crystal Palace, as you mentioned, and they both decide, let's go to the semi-finals. Wanderers then get Queen's Park. And so Queen's Park couldn't travel, so they get the walkover. So the Wanderers...
But Queen's Park do turn up for the first game.
They do turn up
for
the first game,
it's not quite as simple as that. Queen's Park do turn up for the semi-final, which is quite a shift for them. And draw 0-0, but decide that when the replay, presumably they were hoping they were going to persuade the Wanderers to play the replay in Scotland, and that was a gamble that just didn't work because that just wasn't happening.
This is the bizarre thing because this was a period where you could decide if you play an extra 30 minutes, and the Wanderers did propose this, and Queen's Park refused it. So I can only think, and based on what I saw in Julian Fellowes' English game, that someone's got injured or someone's on top in the game, and Queen's Park just didn't fancy it because they do refuse the extra 30 minutes to finish the tie there and then. And you're right, Graham, they're off to Scotland, and I don't even know the date of the rearranged game. There's no dates I can find because all of these games take place. It's not like an FA Cup semi-final weekend where you got both games taking place almost in the same weekend. Crystal Palace play Royal Engineers in February, and Queen's Park and Wanderers play in March. So I think there's almost 2 weeks between the two fixtures. And then the replay, Royal Engineers and Crystal Palace, they drew. It's almost like 3 weeks have passed before they play the replay.
Also worth noting, if I've understood this correctly, that from the semi-final stage, the corners exist now, and the corners hadn't existed beforehand. And I think that's probably...
new thing, yes.
As a rule change, that feels quite a significant thing to me. But
yeah, so there were some versions going back to the Sheffield rules where there weren't corners and you had touchdowns. And touchdowns would have been once the ball's crossed the byline, whichever player touched it first got a touchdown. And in the event of a tie, that's how games are decided. But yeah, the corner kick has been added to the laws of the game, and it's a pretty good addition. I mean, I couldn't see Arsenal win a league championship without the corner kick.
And so we get to the first FA Cup final held at Kennington Oval, the Wanderers and Royal Engineers. There's only 2 bits I know about this game. One is that the winning goal is scored by, as I say, Morton Betts, who like quite a lot of that the Wanderers team. We should probably talk about the Wanderers in a bit more detail after this. Is an ex-Harrow pupil. He was meant to play for Harrow Checkers. He turns up in the final playing for the Wanderers. I suspect had he known that he was how big the FA Cup was going to become, he would not have chosen to play under a pseudonym, but he does. He plays under the pseudonym A.H. Checker, I think as a reference or a nod to his real team. I mean, obviously, there's no suggestion, I don't think. I mean, obviously, he couldn't be cup tied because they didn't play the game, and I'm not even sure cup tying was a thing.
As long as you're not professional, that's the key thing. You've got to be an amateur.
Yeah.
Anything else you might let go.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. We've kind of skipped over that. This is amateur football. Professionalism is illegal at this point. And it's probably worth noting that for what comes 10 years down the line. Yeah, this is an amateur game. But it's an amateur game where supporters are already taking an interest in the game. 2,000 people turn up at this first FA Cup final. I don't know what they pay, like a penny or a shilling or whatever it would be back in the day. But it's a paying public audience that turned up to watch this game of football. So where is the money going if the players aren't being paid for what they're doing on the pitch? And I think from the public school perspective, where most of these teams, Wanderers and Royal Engineers, they're public school teams, they're okay with that because this is recreation for them. You know, it's a bit more serious now. They've got this FA Cup, FA Challenge Cup to compete for, but it's recreational. It's fun. It's an extension of their daily duties where they're lawyers and doctors and whatever.
The other thing that happens after Morton Betts scores, he scores after 15 minutes, or AH Checker, is the teams change ends. And I think football would be so much better.
Brilliant.
If you changed ends after every goal. That seems absolutely brilliant to me. Why did they change it?
Can you imagine how much you could slow the game down even more? You just scored a goal, and then how slow could the goalkeeper make their way today from one end of the pitch to the other, riling the supporters in the process?
Yeah, it was a rule in football. I think it changed in 1872. I think the season after it does change, and they introduced the change in ends at half time as we know it now. But yeah, back in the day, every time a goal was scored, the teams would swap ends. And this was quite significant as well, because apparently on this March final, it was quite blowy, but the sun was out and was blowing in a particular direction. The sun was in the eyes as well. So the Royal Engineers, I think, who went 1-0 down, then had the sun and the wind on their backs, but didn't take advantage of it. That's as I know it. Graham, there is another significant thing that does happen in this game that's worth noting. Edmund Creswell breaks his collarbone after 10 minutes in the final. So this is before substitutions, and substitutions are decades and decades away. We don't even get substitutions in late 1960s, early 1970s, so 100 years away. So the Royal Engineers are playing pretty much the whole game with 10 players.
My last bit of information is nothing to do with this game, but to do with Morton Betts, who is a bit of a sporting all-rounder. He plays some county cricket for Middlesex and Kent, I think it is. Plays some matches there. But he wins one cap for England about 5-6 years later. Only wins one cap at all. But he plays in goal. So he can be, surely, I would think, the only answer to a quiz question as to which outfield player has scored a winning goal in an FA Cup final and won one cap for England in goal.
Brilliant quiz question.
I mean, it's about 10 quiz questions in one, isn't it? It's probably the ultimate quiz question answer. And so there we have it. The Wanderers are the first ever winners of the FA Cup. That sort of feels appropriate, given that Charles Alcock was the brains behind it, and it seems somehow fitting that he is the first person to... Does he lift the FA Cup, Phil?
I don't know if he... I presume he must have done, but there was a cup, however small. So I presume maybe it seems slightly ostentatious and not the done thing for an ex... I think, did he go to Harrow or Eton? To kind of go lifting cups as such. I doubt if there was a lot of champagne sprayed either, but my guess there was probably just I'm just guessing, reading between the lines, and this isn't, I don't think Julian Fellows in the English game picks up on this. I guess he probably briefly lifts the trophy in a slightly undramatic way before putting it down and going back to his duties as a solicitor or a mill owner or something.
It was presented officially 3 weeks later at the Wanderers annual dinner, the Pall Mall restaurant, Charing Cross. It was presented by the then Football Association president, Ebenezer Morley. Ebenezer,
good name.
And each player was given a silk badge as well. So there you go, commemorating the occasion with a Cub Scout badge still on their jumpers.
And the Wanderers are an epically important team in the creation of football. But who are they?
Yeah. Phil?
Who are they? Yeah. They are an important club, aren't they? Because they were one of the earliest organised football clubs. So first of all, they were known as Forest FC, and it might not come as a big surprise that they were formed by public school pupils before they adopted the name of Wanderers in 1864. What I found kind of really fascinating about the Wanderers, and it's not a surprise given the name, but the club's structure even at the time was quite unusual because they were a wandering side with no fixed home ground, and they drew players from the amateur kind of elite, I suppose, notably Aldertonians and Harrovians. There wasn't anybody, as far as I could tell, despite my research from Spennymoor Comprehensive, anywhere near this particular team. And their success was built on a core group of leading amateur players. And we've already mentioned Charles Alcock. And we might come on to kind of mention Arthur Kinnaird as well. So the same people who were shaping the rules were also playing for the Wanderers at the same time. They were very important. We'll kind of touch on this, but they were a pretty dominant force in the early FA Cup. They won the first and then won their fourth by 1878. before actually starting to kind of decline later on from the 18, kind of after their fifth triumph in the FA Cup. It was after that was probably their high point. The kind of more organised clubs and the professionalism of the game meant that they kind of effectively disappeared from senior football in the 1880s, which is a bit of a shame, isn't it? Because they were the kind of the Harlem Globetrotters of the day.
You say Harlem Globetrotters, I say travelling Wilburys. I would think more accurate. A collection of old boys just doing their thing and doing it quite well. It's quite bizarre. I mean, I think they're quite fortunate to win the very first FA Cup. I would argue that the Royal Engineers were probably the stronger of the two teams, and maybe going down to 10 men didn't help. But then by a quirk, the only time ever in the history of the FA Cup, the winners get a bye to next season's final. So they don't even have to play a game. They just have to sit there and wait to see who will be joining them. Not at the Kennington Oval. It will actually played at Lille Bridge in, I think, Fulham for the one and only time before it returns back to the Kennington Oval. But yeah, I mean, the beautiful thing about the Wanderers that should never get lost is their kit. It's very narrow hoops. I think it must be like a dozen or more hoops, and it's in the sequence of black, orange, and pink. And it's quite a spectacular football kit. And through Harrow School, they have been kind of like a fresh incarnation of the Wanderers, not the real ones. And they've honoured the Wanderers by playing in that very kit as well. So it's a modern day version of the black, the orange, and the pink.
Okay, well, we got one FA Cup out of the way. Under our original timeline.
11 more to go.
Yes, 11 more to go. We'll take a quick break and then we'll work out how we're going to do that. Okay, so welcome back. We are trying to make our way through the FA Cup pioneers. We won't go into quite as much detail in these next ones as in that first tournament. But it's fair to say the rules are still evolving and that the kind of FA Cup is growing. I guess more and more teams enter, don't they?
Yeah, so in 1871 and 72, when it starts, 15 teams are listed. In 1872, 73, I think it's only 16 teams that are listed. So slow progress, but after that, it doubles in size and then just kind of grows and grows and grows to the point where we get to, I think, 1884, where we've got over 100 teams and over 100 matches being played. So its popularity is growing. And it's also important to mention that football in the North is growing quite rapidly as well. But there's a different mindset to what's going on in the north of England. At the moment, the FA Cup is still very much the public schools that are running it, that are dominating it. But the teams in the north, with access to get to games, because of the railway network, are beginning to have a presence in the FA Cup. And it's important to point out the distinction because generally the teams in the north would be factory workers, mill workers, what we would call these days working class folk, whereby the south is primarily the elites.
Yeah. Whereas in the first iteration, you had Donington, 1872-73, there are no northern teams apart from welcome back last year's semi-finalists in Queen's Park, who, ended up having essentially a bye to the semi-final in the first iteration. What happens to them in the second iteration there, Phil?
Funnily enough, yeah. So this is 1872, 1873, isn't it? So you get to the first round, 14 teams, all play, except Queen's Park and defending champions Wanderers, as Jamie said. Wanderers get a bye to the final. I think Queen's Park get a bye just because they're Queen's Park, really. Let's whiz forward a little bit for the sake of brevity. You get to the semi-finals where Queen's Park basically withdraw at the semi-final stage and forfeit their game.
Which would have been their first. They essentially get a bye all the way to the semi-final. Yeah. And so presumably their rules at this stage is either we get a bye to the final or we're not doing this.
Yeah.
And given that the FA had given Wanderers a bye to the final, that would make it quite difficult to play any games or anyone else to do anything.
Could be in the end of the FA Cup.
I suppose the breakthrough team in this year is Oxford University. This is not exactly cutting new blood from Eton, Harrow and so forth, but Oxford University make their way through the tournament, and they beat Maidenhead, I think, in the semi-final to set up a clash with Wanderers in the FA Cup final. Now, I think there's an added twist to this because the FA Cup kicks off in the morning, doesn't it? Because they are trying to avoid a clash with the Oxford-Cambridge boat race. I mean, what are the chances of Oxford University being on Cup final grandstand and the boat race on the same day?
It's kind of interesting that at this point, the boat race takes precedence, doesn't it? It's the FA Cup that's got to be moved and takes place at 11 o'clock rather than the usual 3 o'clock. And it's the boat race that is the most important of all of the different kind of sporting events that are happening in London on that day.
The boat race has history. It's got some kind of depth of pedigree, hasn't it? Where the FA Cup, this is the second version. And Wanderers, not only have they got the bye to the final, they have dictated where the game gets played as well, because they actually have no home ground. So they're the ones that chose to play this game in West Brompton, Lille Bridge. So everything is stacked in the favour of the Wanderers. They haven't played a single match, which begs the question how the players were keeping themselves ready for this. And, what was their interest in the early rounds as well, in terms of who they fancied and were they scouted? It raises a whole manner of questions that we'll probably never have answers to.
It's had a knock-on, probably an inverse effect of potentially devaluing the high-profile quarterfinals and FA and semi-final stage, because there's only one quarterfinal, which is Oxford University v Maidenhead. I wrongly said that the semi-final. It's the quarterfinal, which there's only...
technically you're right, but it was a semi-final because Queen's Park.
It becomes a semi-final because there's only one semi-final, because Wanderers get a route through, which is Queen's Park v Oxford University, but Queen's Park don't turn up in that. So basically, between the quarterfinal and the final stage, there were just two matches. The only other thing, I don't know if you guys got anything from this game, but the bit I did like about this was because Wanderers take a lead through Arthur Kinnard, and I think we'll talk about Arthur Kinnard after this. And Jamie, I think from memory, the formations were pretty attacking the best of times. It was pretty much 2 defenders and 8 attackers. But what I have read about this is with about 15, 20 minutes to go, or maybe more than that, Oxford University decide, do you know what? Let's play without a goalkeeper. And so they push their goalkeeper up front, not for a corner at the end, but literally for sort of 20 minutes, half an hour or so. And then are surprised the Wanderers get a goal on the break.
It begs the question how football really was played. And we know it was a dribbling game where one player would just run as far as he could with the football, and then the opponent would win possession and do the same. But a 1-1-8 formation is just fantastic. And a 1-1-8 formation with Oxford University decided to go 0 in terms of goalkeeper, and it becomes a 1-1-9 formation. It's just incredible. It kind of begs the question how this game would have been played. And it really begs the question, what were people really interested in watching? There's no passing. They've got a combined total of 17 forwards on the pitch at the end of the game. It's just, it's kitchen sink time, isn't it? But for the full 90.
I was just thinking it was a definition of a high press.
Arthur Kinnard gets the Wanderers' first goal, and he's quite a significant figure in these early years, isn't he?
Yeah, so Arthur Kinnard is there from the very beginning. So he's involved in the FA. He becomes a Wanderers player. He also goes on and plays for Old Etonians. I think there's an argument that the Old Etonians were probably a better team than the Wanderers, but they only won 2 of the early FA Cups. But when he reaches the end of his football career, he's played in 9 FA Cup finals. He's won 5 of those finals with both the Wanderers and Old Etonians, which was a record up until 2010, 2011, 2012, when Ashley Cole won his 6th FA Cup, just beating Arthur Kennard then. That's how long he was the record holder in terms of the most FA Cups won. But he also goes on to become the president of the Football Association, and he's there for a very long time, up until his death, actually, in 1923. So he's one of the biggest characters in the early days of football, and he's an incredibly strong character because he is there to oversee the transition into professionalism as well. So he's there to oversee the growth of leagues, the Football League being formed in 1888, a second division, a South division that then becomes a third division in 1921. So Arthur Kennard is there at the very forefront of the early days of football, right through to when Herbert Chapman is modernizing football. The time that he spends in football really spans that amount of time.
You see the chap who looks a little bit like W.G. Grace as well?
He is exactly the chap that looks like W.G. Grace, yes.
Almost right down to the same kit.
Yeah, I mean, they could be the same drawing. Would it have been? Painting? Although photography was about in 1872. Photography had been around for 20, 30 years by that point.
When we get to the following year, 1873-74, the Cup is expanding out. There are 28 teams this time. I always find it quite interesting looking at the names of the teams who are in there, because there'll be someone who you've got absolutely no idea. One of the teams that joins in this is a team called Gitanos Football Club, who it turns out, I know nothing about them, primarily consists of old Etonians or old Carthusians, all from Charterhouse. I don't know how many players played for, what the movement was like between the players, but it feels like they're all interconnected.
They're the gypsies. Gitanos is Spanish for gypsy.
Oh, there we go.
The gypsies. So they've called themselves the gypsies, but they've done it in a kind of slightly disguised ways for those who really understand Spanish. So I missed that team. I looked at all the teams. I clearly didn't look at all the teams because I completely missed that team. I like the idea of the Trojans, who also compete in this third edition of the FA Cup. When you think about, the origins of that word. They also played at West Ham.
Oh, there you go. Arthur Kennard does play for Gitanos as well. Arthur Kennard does feel like a player made for a football chant, doesn't he? But we'll let that one go for now. We do have a couple of northern sides or sides from outside the home counties in London. There is a Sheffield, one of the very first, and they're drawn against Shropshire Wanderers. I mean, it seems like there's some logic. This cannot be Graham Kelly's Velvet Red Bag. The fact that the teams who are some way away from London keep drawing each other. But at least, there's a logic. Why would you not pit those two sides up against each other?
Yeah, I mean, budget is going to be a factor. The teams in the north don't have access to the teams in the south in terms of the public schools. So, finance is going to be a factor. So there's absolutely some help going on in the draw to make sure that certain teams don't have to travel so far in the early rounds. That changes as you get to the latter stages. Or if you're Queen's Park, you just get a bye straight to the semi-final anyway.
Queen's Park aren't in this one, are they? But the Wanderers, now they have obviously decided that we can't just let the team go straight to the FA for final. That's not working well. But what the Wanderers do get walkovers for the first two. They still go 2 rounds without playing anyone. But their third round game is interesting because they are up against beaten finalists RCR Oxford University.
Yeah.
And that's a draw in the first game. They decide rather than, maybe at this point they've decided that you do need to have a replay rather than just deciding whether you want to have a replay or not. So they do have a replay, and Oxford University win, and Wanderers record their first ever defeat.
The holders are out, and last year's runners-up are through to the next round. Will they go on and get to the final?
The only thing I know about this is that the first goal is scored by a chap called Charles Alcock for Oxford University. And this is perhaps not, it's not a surprise. The modern development of a footballer is post-career they appear on Celebrity Love Island. With the benefit of a public school education and whatever other benefits, Charles Magnus goes on to become Archdeacon of Riding in Yorkshire. So hence, as I was telling Jamie and Phil beforehand, I was desperately trying to think of an ecclesiastical footballer who had scored in a final. I desperately wanted it to be Ian Bishop, but you came up with a genuine ecclesiastical figure.
I think Gavin Peacock probably may fit the mold. I don't know. He turned his back on football and was considered a fairly decent pundit after a fairly good playing career, and become a priest or a monk, or just, I don't know what he become.
So yes, Oxford University are winners of that FA Cup.
One small one, but two brothers, William and Herbert Rawson, play together, but on opposite sides. Could be the first time that happened.
First time.
The following season, Royal Engineers gained their revenge and beat Oxford University in the final. By the time we get to 1875-76, where Wanderers have their third triumph, the Cup has gloriously got 32 teams. So this is kind of
it all works.
I say it's got 32 teams. 5 teams don't turn up, including our old friends Harrow Checkers, who have quite a bad reputation for not. It's quite bad form, I would say. And then we don't have Queen's Park, but Clydesdale from Glasgow, perhaps, who can blame them, didn't fancy the trip to South Norwood in the first round. High Wycombe, not to be confused with Wycombe Wanderers, I don't think, and they lose 15-0 to the Royal Engineers, which at this point I think must be the biggest win in the competition. So Wanderers get to the final again, where they play Old Etonians. So that feels like that might be something of a local derby, and it's a close one. That one finishes 1-1, but this is the first FA Cup final replay.
Yeah, and it's worth noting as well, Arthur Kinnaird has moved from the Wanderers to Old Etonians. So he plays in the final for the Old Etonians against his former club, Wanderers.
It's also potentially notable because it's the return of Charles Alcock as well, not as an administrator, not as a player, but as a referee this time.
Yeah.
In the final and the replay as well. He's everywhere. He's all over the FA Cup.
Yeah, that is quite impressive, isn't it? So Wanderers win their third FA Cup and they make it through to the final again the following year. They beat Cambridge University in the semi-final, which, given that Oxford University had got a bye through to the final, we didn't see the first varsity final in the FA Cup, which would have been something. Now, Wanderers v Oxford University, two quite regular teams who are playing there. This one finishes 2-1, but from what I can tell, this finishes 2-1 after extra time, another first.
Yeah, so the team decided that they would play the extra 30 minutes.
No cup final would be complete without a Arthur Kinnaird fact. Arthur Kinnaird played in this game for Wanderers.
Yes.
Where did he play? I mean, the man who's a regular goal scorer. Yeah, he played in goal.
Yeah, he played in goal. And not only that, he scored Oxford United's goal.
Oxford University's goal.
Oxford United. God, I got an Oxford United reference in this podcast.
Yeah, it happened. I knew we'd win the cup by default.
Yeah. Sorry, Graham. Oxford University. Yeah, Arthur Kinnaird has scored the goal that gives Oxford University the lead. And, the Wanderers equalised late on as well. It's 4 minutes from the end when Wanderers get the equaliser to take it to added time.
So he basically catches the ball. I mean, who knew that if you put your striker in goal, it wouldn't be perfect. So he catches the goal and he sort of drags it behind the goal line. It's credited as an own goal, except I did read various stories about how there was a period in which that goal then they kind of reevaluated it and decided that it didn't count. And so the score went down in the kind of the official books as a 2-0 win after extra time, despite there being no explanation as to why Wanderers, being 1-0 up, decided then to play 30 minutes of extra time.
Yeah, it's incredible. And it wasn't until the 1980s that the Oxford University actually got their goal back. And so it looks at 2-1. But yeah, for over 100 years, it stayed at 2-0 in a game that went to extra time after Wanderers were winning 1-0, but really it was 1-1. It's all bizarre.
Also noteworthy is Wanderers' first goal scorer. The guy gets the equaliser or gives them the lead, depending which version of history you're talking about, because that is one Jarvis Kenrick.
It is.
And I am starting to think there's only 40 or 50 players playing across all these teams. So Wanderers have their fourth and second consecutive FA Cup, and they go on and make the following season, 1877-78, they make it 5 wins on the trot.
Yeah, 77-78. It's more notable because teams from the north now are starting to bleed into the draw. There's a team called Manchester who played Darwin. Now, Darwin have a pretty important role to play in the early days of the FA Cup, especially leading towards professionalism. But you've also got a team that most people will have heard of called Notts County. I think they are officially the oldest professional football team. They make their debut in the FA Cup as well, and they're drawn to Sheffield. Now, I don't know if the proximity has got anything to do with the draw there, but that is their opponents. So we are starting to see more teams enter the FA Cup, and we're starting to see more teams from the north of England. Queen's Park get a bye, by the way, Graham.
I should have mentioned, I omitted that Queen's Park were back in the previous year's FA Cup, where they got 2 byes before making it to the third round, where they didn't turn up and awarded the game to the opposition. In this season, they get a bye in the first round and then don't turn up for their second round. So
they got form.
You have to admire both Queen's Park's willingness to enter a competition, which I'm not dissing Queen's Park at all. And we did a previous podcast on which, by the way, I can remember nothing. If that feels like a lifetime ago. So
it was a long time ago. But you know, in the second round where they don't turn up for the fixture and it's a walkover against Druids. Now, Druids, who've come through the first round, are the very first team from Wales to participate in the FA Cup. So that's quite noteworthy.
But again, we set up a final against Royal Engineers, and Arthur Kinnaird must have done something in that one.
Well, he was the captain. He was back in his, I think he was back in a half-back position. Now, Kinnaird was normally a forward, but clearly he was a jack of all trades. Well, he was a jack of all trades in terms of what he goes on to achieve. But yeah, he is playing for Wanderers, but he's playing more of a defensive role. And I think Kinnaird is accredited with one of the goals in this final. But 2 goals come from our man, Jarvis Kenrick. One thing to note, and it's quite important in terms of where this is going in the next 10 years, the attendance is growing every single season. So now that it's reported 4,500 people came to the Kennington Oval to watch this particular final. So the appetite for football across the country, or in the South in particular, but I think it's across the country, is definitely growing. One good thing about the Royal Engineers team, Graham, that's worth noting is that every single player in the team is a lieutenant, which begs the question, who was the captain?
I love it. Sadly, I don't think there's any footage of this, but as you say, 4,500 fans watching this game. And I would have thought the moment there was a sort of controversial decision, we'd have got the first ever cry of and chant of "Who's the bastard in the black?" because the referee was one Sega bastard.
Was.
I know it's childish, isn't it? It would have been better if he was Sega Wanker, but it's closer.
I wonder if that surname is still in existence today. I feel that word has probably taken on a different
yes,
a different identity.
This is kind of the end, though, for Wanderers, isn't it? I mean, that's their last of their trophies. Why do they sort of fade away?
Well, I guess Kinnaird has moved over to the Old Etonians and Alcock has become a referee. But I think it's probably from the next season in particular, we might touch on Darwin, that we start to see more influence by teams outside of the home counties and London, and the development of new teams that are kind of coming from outside of that area, and particularly from the northwest. And associated with that, the greater professionalism of the game and the kind of amateur ethos that underpinned the Wanderers, the fact that, you know, they didn't have a ground and they picked a certain kind of group of ex-public school boys, largely from two particular public schools, just became slightly outdated and old-fashioned.
Darwin is a football team generally made up of factory and mill workers. They've got ambitions to be more of a presence in the FA Cup. And the FA Cup is the only national tournament going on. There is local tournaments, the Lancashire Cup and stuff like that Darwin are participating in. And Darwin, which is not far from Blackburn, if my geography is correct, this is a hotbed of football. At this particular moment in history, I think there's 4 or 5 teams from the Blackburn town as it stands during this period. So teams are popping up all over the place. And it's muted that Darwin has paid for players in what can be seen as the first transfer. So the first transfer for money. So a player called Fergus Suter, who is central to the Julian Fellows, the English Game series, is a real life character. He did play for Darwin. He does go on and play for Blackburn Rovers and has a pretty successful football career. The reports were that he was secretly being paid, and being paid to play football, it was against the rules. So Darwin themselves have invested in ways that goes against the spirit of the game. I think some would argue more in the south of England, but not so much in the north of England, because the teams in the north of England, I think, are trying to find a way to compete with the public schools. And it's difficult because these guys are working 6 days a week. The weekend didn't exist in 1878, 79. It was a kind of something reserved for the elites. So Darwin are looking at ways that they can find a way to beat these big teams. And they go on and have a good run in the FA Cup, and they draw the Old Etonians, and it sets up a pretty fantastic football match.
I was thinking we go back to the English Game because that's the Julian Fellows drama that you can see on Netflix, because actually the first episode starts with the game that takes place, and that's the quarter final in February 1879. Old Etonians, captained by our friend Arthur Kinnaird, played Darwin, and it's a cracking game, at least according to the dramatisation, if Julian Fellows is correct. Old Etonians were something like 5-1 up at half-time, but Darwin came back in the second half, largely due to a team talk by Fergus Suter. Basically told them to pass the ball. Pass and move was basically his instruction. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But the rather physical approach of the Old Etonians was overcome by Darwin, who came back in the second half. And there was a replay. It's about 2 or 3 weeks later, on the 8th of March. Again.
And Darwin had to raise the funds because they don't have the money.
Yeah.
So they have to raise the funds in order to fulfill this fixture.
They played again and drew 2-2. So is this the first example of a second replay? I don't know. But there is a second replay 7 days after the second one. A very tired Darwin team, and they lose 6-2 in the end to the Old Etonians, who make it through to the semi-final. But significant because this is probably the first time that a northern team had kind of broken through and made it as far as the kind of quarter-final, and even threatened Arthur Kinnaird Old Etonians as well.
Old Etonians drawing 5-5 with Darwin is, I think, the first, not giant killing, because obviously Darwin don't win it, but it's definitely the biggest and greatest shock of the FA Cup in its early form. But I think this is the first time we are seeing football tactics played out on the football field in an intelligent manner. It's not just the 1-1-8 or the 1-2-7. Phil's already alluded to it. Fergus Suter decides that in Scotland we play this passing game, so that's how we're going to play Old Etonians. And it definitely has an impact because they compete with probably a stronger team than the sum of their parts. And in the replays, the Old Etonians decide they have to neutralize Suter because he's so good. So tactically, they're marking him out the game, or they're playing him out the game in order to effectively strengthen their chances of winning the game. So I think this is also potentially, and it's hard to prove this because there's been hundreds and hundreds of football games before this, but this is possibly the first time when we're seeing football tactics played out in real time.
There's definitely a changing of the guard happening. And you can see it, as you mentioned, we're seeing more and more teams that are recognisable. So the Old Etonians, when they do finally get through, they play Nottingham Forest in the semi-final. Forest have a brilliant run in there. So
yeah,
their first FA Cup game ever is against Notts County.
Yeah. I wonder why. The luck of the draw. The luck of the draw.
And who knew they would play Sheffield, one of the northern-based teams in the next game.
Luck of the draw.
Luck of the draw once again.
Nottingham Forest's run is also quite significant in terms of what Darwin are doing as well. Darwin obviously are getting a bit more of the kind of the limelight, and I think it's because of the advent of professionalism, and that's definitely what's going on at Darwin. Nottingham Forest, maybe they were doing the same, but it's not out in the public domain as far as I can find. But they've beaten 2 public school teams on their way to the semi-final. So the changing of the guard, and I know Nottingham Forest will probably consider themselves more a Midland-based team than a northern team, but they're definitely north of London and the home counties, and that's primarily what the FA Cup has been up until this season.
It continues in the following season. Forest reach the semi-finals again. There is a pattern emerging. Notts Forest draw Notts County in the first round, usually.
There is a team in this version of the FA Cup, because we're up to, just in case people are confused, I'm confused where we are, to be honest, but 1879-80. So I think we're in the 9th edition or the 8th edition of the FA Cup. There's a team called Mosquitoes, very short-lived football team from South London, but a wonderful name, Mosquitoes.
1880 to 81. Darwin very nearly upset the apple cart. They get to the semi-finals that time round. This one doesn't feel like much has changed because the final is Old Etonians v Old Carthusians, Eton v Charterhouse. So, I mean, that's still very much got a bit of a hint of public school about it, hasn't it? And Charterhouse Old Carthusians win that 3-0. But we are now starting to get to the period where football does change, and 1882 is a particularly significant year because though Old Etonians win the tournament again, we get the first northern side to make the final in the shape of who, Jamie?
Blackburn Rovers. So a football team that everyone knows. Blackburn Rovers. They play in the first round, the luck of the draw, Blackburn Park Road. And it's also worth noting the FA Cup has expanded massively now. It's almost 5 times the size of what it was when it first began 8 years prior to this. And we've got teams like Sheffield Wednesday, Aston Villa, West Bromwich Albion, Bolton Wanderers are all taking part. So we're seeing the signs of the teams that will go on and form the very first football league in 1888 as well. But yeah, Blackburn Rovers negotiate themselves all the way to the final, where they meet the public school boys again, Old Etonians. Guess who's in the Old Etonians team? I bet you can't guess.
Is it Arthur Kinnaird?
It's Arthur Kinnaird, yes. But also, quite interestingly, in the Blackburn Rovers team is a certain Fergus Suter. So Fergus Suter has moved from Darwin to Blackburn Rovers. Fergus Suter and Arthur Kinnaird do face off, and Arthur Kinnaird's Old Etonians come out winners 1-0. Now, this is really significant because this is the very last time a public schools football team will win the FA Cup.
And if you just go through the team sheets, you can probably sense different upbringings. So Blackburn Rovers, who have Fred Hargreaves, John Hargreaves, John Duckworth, Harry Sharples. These are classic kind of northern names, I guess. And they play against Reginald Macaulay, Percy de Paravicini, and of course, famous double-barreled forward, John Barrington Chevalier. Who I think had just done a shift on the mines.
I think you can see
Brilliant.
the team or the team sheet as well, because the programme for this game is one of the oldest recorded programmes that's managed to survive to this day. And the programme itself went in 2013 up for auction at Sotheby's of all places, and was sold, I think it was around £25,000 somebody paid for not somebody, the Old Etonians themselves actually bought it. It was bought by the Old Etonians Football Club, which still exists to this day.
Just one team we wanted to touch upon before we almost wrap this one up. That's Marlow, little old Marlow, who, as an Oxford fan, is pretty grim reminder as I think Marlow's last major achievement. Actually, did Marlow play? Marlow played some Spurs quite recently, didn't they? Or played someone?
Yeah, in the 90s, in the early 1990s.
But they famously knocked Oxford United out 2-0 with about 3 former Oxford players playing for them that day, I think, as it was. But Marlow have a pretty incredible FA Cup record, don't they, Jamie?
Marlow are a fascinating little football club. They were founded in 1870, and they are, I believe, the only football team in the history of the FA Cup that have applied and participated in every single edition of the FA Cup, apart from one in 1910, 1911, when I think their application went in too late. So they weren't able to participate. Now I think Maidenhead probably have a claim to that as well. I haven't substantiated this, but I think Maidenhead also have applied and potentially participated in every single version of the FA Cup apart from one. Marlow play in the 8th tier of the English football period. Maidenhead recently were in the conference. I think they may have dropped out of that, but so these are home county football teams that have been involved and playing in the FA Cup since its existence. And, Marlow are fascinating as well. I couldn't help it, Graham, because where, as we referenced to it, we live not far from Marlow, not far from Maidenhead. So just today, and knowing that we were doing this podcast, I just drove past the ground and I wandered in and I met one of the directors, Brian Jackson, who was working at the club. Now, the stand at Marlow FC is over 100 years old. I took a picture of it. I will share it. But it was fascinating. The memorabilia on the wall was just incredible. And they've got a photocopy of the original letter where they have invited a number of people to go to the Complete Angler in Marlow to talk about this idea of forming a football team, the origins of the club in 1870. But yeah, it's quite fascinating that a team as small as Marlow in the English football pyramid have this incredible rich history. Yeah, in this version of the FA Cup, 1881, 1882, where Blackburn Rovers get to the final and lose to Old Etonians, Marlow play Old Etonians in the semi-final of the FA Cup. And sadly, for the history books, they do get stuffed.
Yes, disappointing, but good on them. And we get finally to the end of our FA Cup odyssey. And the turning point has definitely come now, 82, 83, which is the year that Blackburn win the FA Cup, but it isn't the Blackburn that we know and love, and certainly one of the previous year. It is Blackburn Olympic.
Yeah, it is Blackburn Olympic, who have a very, very short existence. They only played in the FA Cup for the first time the season before, and then in 1883 they go on and win the whole thing, beating Old Etonians. And yeah, I think this is a symbolic handover for a team that has such a short history. They're the turning point from this moment onwards, the only teams that will win the FA Cup are teams that everyone will recognise in this day and age. So the early days of the public schools dominating and controlling the interest of the FA Cup is gone. Professionalism, albeit has not been accepted as part of the makeup of the game, is there, and it's having an impact. And at some point in the very near future, it will be an absolute thing where footballers are being paid to play football.
So Blackburn Olympic reached the final. They play Old Etonians. That is Arthur Kennard's final game. That's his ninth and final game as captain of Old Etonians. This is definitely a transition, isn't it? And by this stage, is the general view that players are being paid?
Yeah, there was a concern, particularly within the FA. The rules of the FA, which prohibited clubs from paying their players, were being worked around and diverted by some of the kind of the Northern and Midlands clubs that were being more successful, kind of more working class clubs as well. And I think Olympics' success in this year's FA Cup probably kind of brought that to a head, actually. You know, Darwin had kind of broken through with two players, Jimmy Love and Fergus Suter, but Olympic had kind of taken it to the next level. And not only kind of take it to the next level in terms of the professionalism of the game and having players that were being paid to play for them, but also perhaps breaking away from the more kind of amateur approach of some of the more traditional clubs, such as the Wanderers and the Royal Engineers and others, Oxford University, because they would be not just paying players, but also having a much more kind of professional setup in terms of training and organisation. And even before the final, I think they took a trip to Blackpool as well. They had a training camp as well. So I think all of that combined was breaking away from the kind of the original ethos, I guess, of the game.
Yeah, there was suspicion in the South in terms of how could Blackburn Olympic, a team from the North, considered and probably looked down upon largely from people in the South. How could these players afford to take a week off to go to Blackpool to do a training camp? And that's exactly what it was. It was a training camp in preparation for the final. So suspicion was definitely a key point. And investigations were kicked off to the point where I think the FA concluded that players being paid was definitely a factor. And then they started to threaten football teams that they would get banned. And this is at the point where football teams in the North said, well, you can ban us. We'll just create our own association. We'll have our own cup competition. We won't belong to yours. And then for a very short spell, the FA and the FA Cup looked like it could die and fade away. But fortunately for the history of the game, the FA came to some kind of sense and decided that professionalism would now be legal, and they allowed it, and the game has changed forever. And one footnote that's worth noting with Blackburn Olympic, I think this is the very first time we get what we like to call the open top bus celebration. Because when they get back to Blackburn, they don't get the open top bus, but they get a civic reception. Thousands and thousands of people, God knows which Blackburn team they're supporting at this particular point, but they're out on the streets celebrating Blackburn Olympics victory. There's a brass band, there's fireworks. So we are seeing the working classes people taking football in the FA Cup to their hearts. And this is what the FA Cup has been and should always be about. It's just having that incredibly great occasion where your team, no matter where it plays in the pyramid, has the chance to go deep into the FA Cup, and who knows, if you dream hard enough, may actually win the thing one day.
There we have it, the glorious open-top bus parade for people to enjoy the trophy victory, compared to the first one where I think the cup was given out over high table at Eton or wherever it was. So the journey is complete. Right, we should get to ranking something. I think we have to rank the Wanderers. As a reminder, we've got 5 categories of greatness. All-time greats at the top, true greats. Touch greatness are mid-tier category, and then edge greatness. And link of greats, Jamie.
You know what? There is an argument, and I'll stress an argument. They could be all-time greats. They win the first ever FA Cup. They win 5 FA Cups. They win 3 in a row. Blackburn Rovers went on and won 3 in a row shortly after this, and they're the only 2 teams, I think, to have won 3 FA Cups in a row. Maybe Arsenal have done it recently, I can't remember. And they dominated football in this early period where football is transitioning at such a rapid pace. I mean, literally by 1883, Wanderers are on a decline to the point where in the next few years, they're not even going to exist any longer. So they weren't able to keep pace with what football was, even though they were one of the early pace setters. So there is an argument for all-time greats, but I can't possibly put them in there because the football doesn't really know what it is at this point. Pretty much they get a bye almost get a bye to the final for the first one. They get they're handed a place in the final for the second one, and they do win the 3 in a row. I think it's probably no more than a touch of greatness, and even then I'm thinking I'm being charitable.
I was thinking edge of greatness, but for many of the same reasons that Jamie was kind of mentioning. They were incredibly successful. They were the dominant force in the early FA Cup. You know, you can't deny they won 5 titles between 72 and 1878. And just winning the inaugural kind of competition in 1872 is kind of quite a big deal. And again, I suppose, who knows what Charles Alcock thought would have happened as a result of the FA Cup. I think he probably, because despite being born in Sunderland, by the way, but he was a public school boy who was obviously kind of instrumental in the Wanderers and the early development of the game, as were Kinnaid and others. I think they opened a kind of genie's bottle to some extent, didn't they? They wanted to kind of get formalization of the game and to popularize the game. I wondered if they ever imagined that it would be there'd be this shift from the south to the north and from amateurs to professionals and from a kind of amateur pastime to what is starting to become a kind of mass spectator sport. And the Wanderers were going against the tide a little bit, but still instrumental in the early development of the game. So I'd be slightly more generous with an edge.
It's tough, and I hadn't even considered it because I didn't even mention it in the list of categories. Then now I think about it, I think this is absolute centre of our random and road category. Not necessarily great, but without them, we wouldn't be where we are today because...
I agree.
Because that's absolutely it, isn't it? They are the definition of that entry, of that category. Now I think about it. I don't know why it didn't occur to me before, but because you can't judge their greatness.
You can't punish them for being pioneers. I agree with you. Sorry, Phil. I think Graham has stumbled into the right bracket here. I think if it feels right, it's got to be right, right?
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah.
So we have to say that the Wanderers are not necessarily great, but without them, we wouldn't be where we are today. Excellent. Okay, well, we have had an enjoyable trip down. It's not even memory lane. It's nothing we knew about. And we're just hoping that the combination of Wikipedia and Julian Fellows proves a reliable source of history. Phil, thank you for joining us in this slightly harebrained scheme.
Oh, my pleasure. I think we should come together and go to a Marlow Town game at some point.
Yeah.
Just to support our local club and to celebrate the history of the FA Cup.
Jamie, thank you as ever.
Yeah, thank you. That was not the easiest one we've ever done, I don't think, Graham. It was an ambitious goal when we decided to do this, and I'm so glad and so grateful and pleased that we had Phil on board to help us.
I've learned a lot about the game in the process as well. Awful lot I knew about. Didn't know about the rules or the development of the game. I certainly didn't recognise the importance of the FA Challenge Cup for the development of the game. I'll look on next year's FA Cup probably with a more understanding than maybe this year's when we got knocked out by Port Vale. I didn't mention the game, the third round win against Oxford. I was at the fourth round game against Oxford United where we won. But anyway.
Well, that seems an appropriate note to end it all. Where do we go after this? Well, we're not quite going bang up to date, but we are starting to get ourselves into World Cup fever. We are going back to US 94.